And our next and final talk for this session is ACDC, Anonymous Crowdsourcing using Digital Cash. And Luis Adán Saavedra del Toro will give the presentation. Oh, yeah.
Yes, thanks. Great. Right. Yes, so this work was funded partially by Nokia Bell Labs and Fundación Mapfre One Arteme, and was done in collaboration with my supervisor, Alastair Beresford. So first of all, we need to consider what crowdsourcing applications are. And so these are typically applications which obtain data from honest participants, and these contributors, we'll call them, report observable or measurable properties of, for example, a city. And then this is in turn served to other users such that it can inform their future decisions. So we can see here a few examples. These typically include reviews, occupancy of public places and transport, traffic data, etc. And so some interesting examples in terms of traffic are Google Maps, and more interestingly, Waze, Google Waze, which you can see on the right. And this works by both automatically getting data from user devices, but also by manually uploading some reports, which, as I said, are then shown to other users. This way, Google is able to collect information about how the vehicles and how their users move through the city. So this is what a traditional crowdsourcing approach would look like. So again, going on with the example of traffic, we have all of these vehicles, all of these users who are authenticated. And so the app in the middle has quite a big database with all of the user identifiers. And even though the data is encrypted between the users and the application, the application then has a complete view of all the users. And then the summary of this data can be computed and presented to all the other users, whether they contribute or not. It depends on the application. And typically, this is done by applying some sort of k-anonymity, aggregation of noise, differential privacy, etc. So yeah, this means that the users are trusting, in this case, Google or whatever the application, with all of their location data, as well as their personal identifiers. So why does Google need to collect, or why does an application need to collect typically all of these data points? Well, and why do they need to know exactly who contributed what? Well, crowdsourcing systems are typically at risk of suffering civil attacks. And this occurs when a malicious user overwhelms a crowdsourcing system by obtaining multiple accounts, or by by submitting enough bogus data such that the app no longer works correctly. Once again, all crowdsourcing systems suffer from these problems, even those that have a central database, although this can help in some cases. And here we're going to watch an example of Google's own Google Maps. If we can play the video. This is an example of it being hacked by a man in Germany, simply walking around with a cart full of 99 phones. And what we can see here on the map is that he's going through pretty much an empty street. But since he has multiple devices, Google will interpret this as there being a sort of a traffic jam. And so it will even route cars to go a different route. Yeah, so this is even though Google has tried to obviously attempt to validate user accounts. Okay, so coming back to the traditional solution, they typically increase the user authentication to make sure that contributions are made by legitimate users only. This is very privacy invasive, obviously, as we've mentioned. And so each data item is authenticated via either personal identifiers, such as email and mobile phones and so on, or via indirect identifiers, such as IP addresses. And the problem with this is that for every crowdsourcing application that we can think of, pretty much, location data is quite critical. So if we're talking about occupancy of public spaces, air quality maps, temperature maps, traffic reports, and so on, pretty much most crowdsourcing applications will need location data to be useful. And so traditional approaches require trusting the apps with this data, and even though the attack in our previous slide is a bit of an edge case, it shows that even the privacy invasive approach doesn't quite protect against civil attacks. And even though our approach is not perfect in that sense either, we try to tackle the privacy aspects. So what's our approach? Our key idea to solve this problem is to, without opening our system to civil attacks, is to still separate the authentication step, which is the checking the legitimacy of each contributor, from the report submission, which is the data collection step. So that our goal is that when an app receives a packet of data, it knows that it has been sent by a validated contributor, but not exactly by which. And so there's multiple existing approaches to this, such as pseudonyms and blind signature schemes, but this will typically require either trusted infrastructure or middleware systems and extra computations and so on. So we have used a tweaked version of Helm's digital cache protocols, and we made one important but minor change to the digital cache protocol, such that we can tie the contributors' reports to their digital tokens, which they obtain during their authenticated phase. And this allows the app developers to receive the token, but it also allows other users to receive the token. We'll come back to this later in the talk. So now what we have are 3 different entities instead of 2, whereas previously we had the contributor and the application. Now we have contributors, an identity authority, and the application. And so the contributors are still the ones who produce the data. They authenticate themselves to the identity authority, and they report and prove to the app that they are valid contributors. And the way they do this is because they obtain blindly signed tokens from the identity authority, who checks the authenticated contributors are valid contributors. And because it signs the tokens blindly, it can limit the amount of reports that any user can make by limiting the tokens that it signs. And then we have the application, which again keeps a record of all of the reports, but these reports are submitted anonymously. And so the application can verify that they have been signed by the identity authority, such that they come from valid contributors, but it does not know exactly which contributor contributed what. As a result of the limiting of the tokens, contributors can only submit, say, n contributions per time period. And this is a part of the system that we can control. So now we have a separation of trust between the identity authority and the application. But another property is that even if these 2 entities colluded, they still could not relate the reports to particular contributors, because the digital tokens have been signed blindly by the identity authority. And the application doesn't know which contributor contributed what. However, they can check whether these tokens have been used more than once, obviously, and based on properties already existing in the digital cash protocols by Shom. These users who double spend or who use tokens more than once can be re-identified, and so they would be banned from the system. So as I said, now we have an authentication stage where the contributors are authenticated to the identity authority, and then they receive blindly collected tokens, blindly signed tokens. And they then use all of these tokens to report their data. So now we have a more anonymized application database, and it still results on the data being available to other users. So using this modified digital cash protocol, we have solved one part of the problem, mainly that data items can now be shared anonymously without attaching any identifiers to them, while knowing that they're still valid contributors making these contributions. And we can use the double spending protections, as I mentioned. So now we are placing a lot less trust on the application itself, but we still need to protect the users when we are collecting location data, because we know from prior research that even access to a handful of location points from a particular individual is enough to identify them to a certain degree. So in the case of traffic reporting, this is particularly crucial, and so the app might be able to follow, for example, a user or an individual car around the city, especially if they're driving at a time where the streets are less busy, or they're going through a country road, and so on. And as we mentioned before, location data is quite an important one in crowdsourcing. And yeah, current solutions such as Google Maps just collect all of this data and then apply the privacy algorithms. So what we have done is, in order to try to do this in a distributed way, is to use local k-anonymity. And so if we focus on the left part of the slide, the way that this would work is if we focus on the car in the middle, for example, it would broadcast a token, it would broadcast a value. Obviously, these numbers scale linearly. These are just indicative numbers, and these are the requirements for the app, but the requirements by each individual user are obviously lower. But then we're also, since we're focusing on mobile devices and so on, we want to check that the power usage is within a modest range. And so we took some measurements on an Android handheld device of both its power usage as well as its timings. And this is based on a previous approach by Daniel Hugenroth et al. And the main idea is that we take a phone, in this case a couple years old Motorola that has a removable battery that we can house in an external 3D printed housing, so we can put a sensor in the middle, and we can measure the data, the power going through it, such that we get readings at 2000 hertz. And so we run our experiments with the, running on battery, obviously, and with display and Wi-Fi off for more accurate checks. So with that, we obtain the following results, and we can see that these are negligible in the case of the cryptographic computations, but also that the main steps of our protocol are also like quite fast, in the order of tens of milliseconds, and this is obviously thanks to the optimizations of typical cryptographic computations in common mobile CPUs. And so we have the same thing for power consumption, where it's also negligibly low. And even for the blinding step and the verification step of digital tokens, we have that they're in the order of a couple millijoules. And so, for a bit of context, previous research has estimated that 4G and LTE packet transmission consumes about 12.8 joules. Now, this figure might be slightly lower, since this was a couple years ago, but still this is in the range of 2,000 to 4,000 times more power consuming than our most demanding cryptographic operations. And so again, this is mainly thanks to optimizations and for common cryptographic operations. And then coming back to the local key anonymity piece, we wondered what a value k would look like in a real scenario. And so we have data obtained from OpenStreetMap of the part of the city center of Aarhus, Denmark. And this includes speed limits and junctions and traffic lights and so on. And so we coupled this with traffic data from the CityPulse Aarhus traffic dataset. And then we simulate traffic in Veins++, which is a network and traffic simulator. So our objective is to obtain a reasonable estimate of whether vehicles can communicate or not with these K anonymity properties. We used a broadcasting range of 300 meters, which is the suggestion by the US Department of Transportation for the next generation, or rather current generation of vehicle-to-vehicle communication standard. We also assumed that cars might need at least 5 seconds to run the full exchange. And with that in mind, we obtained the following results. So we chose 2,000 and 5,000 vehicles as representative of peak and off-peak traffic data in this small area of the city, based on data from the dataset that I mentioned before. And these results show that 50% of the vehicles actually have no vehicles nearby most of the time, where k would be equal to 1. However, 20% of the time, which is a considerable amount of the time, vehicles are able to communicate with at least 20 others within 300 meters. And so we argue that this is likely acceptable for many crowdsourcing applications, and we might require sporadic reports anyways, and also we're not interested in areas where there aren't that many vehicles, because by definition those areas will not be congested anyways. So in conclusion, we think that future crowdsourcing systems should consider building their systems like this. We've mentioned that nowadays crowdsourcing systems are centralized, and a lot of trust is placed on the applications which obtain lots of sensible location data. And this approach requires separating the authentication steps from the reporting, and it gives users more privacy, while still managing civil attacks to a similar extent than current approaches, and identifying malicious users in the process. And then last but not least, we checked that this is actually a practical system that can be implemented in reality with CPU, energy costs, storage, and the simulation of traffic. Thank you.
Thanks for the nice talk. Yeah, I have a question. Given if I know the layout of the city and I know the typical speeds in the different roads, and I know the K, let's say, is 5 or 10 or something, isn't it possible to, from the reports that you obtain, start making inferences of linking different points as part of a trajectory? And once you start being able to recover trajectories, you might be able to move towards identification based on origin and destination of trips? Or do you think that this kind of K will be enough to obfuscate
Yes.
the reports enough that making inferences based on statistics on priors, on how people move, which scenarios might be possible, and that might lead to some leakage there.
Yeah, I think this obviously inherits all the previous problems that have been highlighted with k-anonymity. So yeah, what you're saying is possible, and I think it would be up to each each application that implements this, or each user, to then sort of adequate that better to each particular situation. So I guess it would depend, as you said, on the city, on the amount of traffic and so on. The values of k might be able to be larger, and there could be some studies on like whether that would help and to what degree and so on. But what we wanted to highlight is that our protocol is resistant to users sending each other their digital tokens, and they can validate each other's tokens before submitting our reports. And so they can check with certainty that there are valid contributors around them, which is something that many previous approaches don't have. Yeah, and what else? And also that that it is possible to do this in a relatively quick way, and that is possible. Yeah.
Any more questions?
So you claim that your authentication system can handle the malicious users. Well, let's suppose the next attack. There is a guy with 50 phones, 99 will be too suspicious, according to statistics. And he chooses some street which has 49 cars, takes 50 mobile phones, goes there. 50 phones showing the speed of 5 kilometers per hour, and 49 shows the speed of 60 kilometers per hour. So 49 are being banned because 50 is greater than 49. How can your system resist this scenario?
What I wanted to show with that slide is that even classical approaches where you give a certain company or a certain system all of your data, well, all of your identity, and you submit every report with that data, are still vulnerable to this kind of thing. So obviously our protocol will not solve some of these civil attacks, where you obviously, if someone obtains access to 50 different cars or 50 different phones who are genuinely authenticated by users, then obviously this is very difficult to protect against. But so do other approaches have this problem. So we just don't see the need for sharing that much information with the system, so that what we wanted to show is that we can have the same amount of protection whilst not sharing your identity with a particular system when submitting your data. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
So the 50 cars would still be accepted as real data in our system, because that's very difficult to compare. But then you'd need the 50 different people's identities, and you'd have to follow the protocol correctly with all of those 50 phones.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, maybe it's time. Let's thank the speaker again, and let's go for lunch.